Now, in your book, you focus on some of the modern exponents of sacred science, such as, for example, Ernest Holmes.
Right. And you mentioned, of course, Steiner, which is a
Rudolf
very
Steiner.
Interesting example of a person who applied sacred science to science.
Indeed, he did.
He built his buildings that he built. His
very unusual architecture.
Right, the architecture.
He was enormously creative.
Right.
As people think of him sort of as the Nietzschean Übermensch, the Superman. He was a poet. He was a playwright. He was a sculptor.
Right.
He invented forms of medical practice. He invented forms of economic practice. He invented forms of education.
Right. Which we still use today in the Waldorf schools.
He is the father of movements of painting and
agriculture.
Yes.
He has a whole theory.
Biodynamic farming.
I mean,
he was a creative genius of sorts in more than a dozen different independent areas.
And I think he's probably the best example of this idea of applying sacred science to a material endeavor.
Yeah. And yes, he claimed, of course, that all of his work was based on his inner vision.
Right. Exactly. And he had some pretty outside ideas.
He did indeed.
That were pretty out there.
Well, one of his ideas that made a big impression on me is the idea that our thoughts, our very thoughts, are living beings.
Right.
Our thoughts are each thought we have is in effect a spiritual entity.
And then you mentioned Ernest Holmes, the New Thought movement, which started with Christian healing, essentially, this idea, because the Christ figure, Jesus, was certainly a practitioner of sacred science, bringing people from the dead and walking on water, whatever these things are attributed to, that it is thought, the thought and intention and belief can create your own reality. And of course, if we go back to a deeper look at quantum physics, the idea of the observer effect, collapsing the quantum wave into a material reality. This is all coming from the same idea. Okay?
Yes, in fact, as I recall, back in, I think it was about 1969, the French physicist Costa de Beauregard published an article in Scientific American in which he said, we now know that the distinction between objective and subjective is only an illusion.
Okay, there you go. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really the thinking. And how do we apply that today? Well, we are relatively brainwashed, I mean, with this belief that anything that is real is material. And it's a very, again, in my opinion, and a lot of other people, it's a very limited way to look at reality because everything else is discounted. It's like any other thoughts or any other dreams. I mean, if we talk about dreams, it's like, oh, they're interesting and, they're fascinating maybe, but they don't have any bearing on how I'm going to make a living or how I'm going to drive my car down the road or whatever. I mean, but we have evidence of things that appear to have meaning. People that are really nice to their car doesn't break down as often. You hear stories like that. People that are always angry at their computer never works. We have those kinds of stories, and I think there's more to it. More reality to it than it's a joke and it's silly. And it's like, well, that can't happen. But these are little tiny snippets of this, and we talk about paranormal, psi. I mean, any of these things that we experience, and I mentioned these three cases in my book.
We will focus on that psychokinesis in yet another conversation.
Right, but it goes, it's just these tiny demonstrations of this sacred science at work, even when we're not paying attention to it.
Well, one of the other exponents of sacred science in the modern era that you mentioned is Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society.
Right. Yes, quite a figure, and she has not fared very well in the modern view of her as a
Well, you know, she was
charlatan.
attacked as being a fraud and attacked by the Society for Psychical Research. In fact, in London, Richard Hodgson went to India at a time when she was claiming that letters were materializing from the hidden masters that were communicating, and they would just drop from the ceiling.
Right.
Those letters are in the British Museum today, but Hodgson analyzed them, and he said, oh, these are all fraudulent. He did a handwriting analysis, and he said, she wrote them.
Right.
And so her reputation was ruined for nearly a century. But what many people don't know is that the Society for Psychical Research has issued a formal apology to the Theosophical Society 100 years later, because more recent investigations showed that Hodgson was wrong.
Right.
That the handwriting analysis does not justify his conclusion that she faked those letters. Not at all.
Yeah, and she also, she was attacked by a lot of the psychics and the mediums of the time, because she pretty much said, you know, you people may be doing this, but as far as talking to the dead or whatever, but that's not really what this is about. And she gave up very early on her own abilities to be able to do things like have flowers drop from the ceiling and whatever, and she said those were parlor tricks.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that anymore, because the real serious work is this inner work. This, you know, it's not doing, that's easy. You know, she would say that's simple. Anybody can, you know, do parlor tricks. And I think she offended a lot of people. And a lot of people had started to attack her and come up with these ideas, these things you're talking about. It was also something about there's like a secret passageway between her room and one of the rooms next to her in her home. They said she would pass stuff through.
No, she was certainly accused. But the truth of the matter is that anyone who appears to manifest what I would call macro psychokinesis is pretty much guaranteed to be accused of fraud, because to the modern mentality, these things are a priori impossible, must be fraud.
Exactly.
No need to look at the evidence
Absolutely.
at that point.